morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this Monday morning. Rethinking Monuments is part of ICOMOS Philippines webinar series. So this is the third event. So just some technical reminders before we start this webinar. This webinar will be broadcasted live on our Facebook page, ICOMOS Philippines. Audience will be placed on mute during the presentation. Please type in your full name or the institution you represent so that we can recognize you, and there will be time for questions after the webinar. We'll have a short 20-minute Q&A before we conclude this presentation. And Zoom participants may ask questions through the Zoom chat function, while viewers from Facebook Live may post their questions or comments on the ICOMOS Facebook page. You can join the conversation and share your thoughts by using the hashtag ICOMOSPH whenever you post anything. Just to say a little bit about our organization is our president, Tina Paterno. Go ahead, Tina.
Thanks, Carissa. Morning, everyone. Thank you for starting your week with us. Please allow me to briefly introduce our organization, the International Council on Monuments and Sites. It's a global NGO in 153 countries, which works for the protection and preservation of heritage places. We are also a consultant to UNESCO on matters of World Heritage. ICOMOS is a very multidisciplinary professional group composed, for example, in the Philippines of archaeologists, architects, economists, engineers, heritage interpreters, tourism professionals, lawyers, structural engineers, historians, community development specialists, urban planners, landscape architects, sociologists, government administrators. Often it takes an interdisciplinary perspective to sustainably preserve and protect heritage. The slide we're showing is a set of interns that we've been training in the last couple of years. Here's a bit of what we do. We did an international field school on photogrammetry. I wrote a position paper on the Intramuros Binondo Bridge. With the University of Tokyo, did a pre-disaster recovery planning workshop with Intramuros and various stakeholders, and did a conference on the seismic retrofit of unreinforced masonry heritage churches in the Philippines soon after the Bohol earthquake. Next slide. And we give talks also. And recently just switched to the webinar series. But enough of ICOMOS. It's my happy task this morning to introduce our speaker, Lila Shahani. I'd like to thank colleague and friend Lila for sharing her thoughts this morning. I hope the broad spectrum opinions of heritage in these strange times spark a much needed discussion on creating more inclusive narratives, on more complete interpretations of our heritage. Not that the narratives we have now are wrong, but that they're incomplete. It's always going to be easier to paint a picture of a hero or a villain for that matter than it is to paint a complete picture of a complex character that's a product of his time. Perhaps if this were truer for more monuments, sites, figures in history, even events, more monuments and sites would have survived today, locally and globally, and we might have had a deeper relationship with heritage. So now to my happy task to introduce the speaker. Thank you to Moderator, Dr. Vince Rafael, and Reactor, Dr. Ian Morley, and a big thank you to Lila. Lila Shahani is the former Secretary General of the Philippine National Commission to UNESCO. Under her leadership and with the help of other government agencies, her team succeeded in obtaining 4 UNESCO designations for the country in intangible cultural heritage, memory of the world, and creative cities. During the previous administration, she was Assistant Secretary and Head of Communications of the Poverty Cluster in the Philippine Cabinet, which covered 26 government agencies dealing with poverty and development. She was also spokesperson of the Interagency Council Against Trafficking. Prior to this, she was Assistant Secretary and Head of Communications of the National Anti-Poverty Commission. For her first job out of college, she worked for the Museum of Philippine Humanities at the CCP, Cultural Center of the Philippines, where she was eventually promoted to Deputy Director. She has taught at the Asian Institute of Management, the Ateneo School of Government, and the University of the Philippines. She has published widely, not only academically, but as a former columnist for the Philippine Star. In addition, she has published with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, ABS-CBN, GMA News, Rappler, Business World, and the Philippine Graphic. She also spent many years in New York, where she did editorial work for the Oxford University Press, writing and research for the United Nations Children's Fund, and policy and communications work for the United Nations Development Program. She's lived in the Philippines, Romania, Australia, Austria, India, Great Britain, and the United States, with extensive travel all over the world. She received her BA in Comparative Literature from Brown University, her MA in International Relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and remains a doctoral candidate in literature at Oxford University. Thank you, Lila Shahani. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tina. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, depending on where on the planet you happen to be at the moment. I am really delighted to see so many dear and familiar faces here. Hi, guys. And I am heartened to meet so many new people. But first, I would like to express my deep thanks to ICOMOS Philippines, which patiently waited for me to slowly formulate my many ideas. Thank you to those who read the various iterations of this paper, both at ICOMOS and elsewhere, and shared with me their many constructive insights. Special thank you to my good friend, Tina Paterno, and her entire team for being so helpful throughout. Maraming salamat. Thank you also to Dr. Ian Morley for being so generous with his feedback, and of course to Vince, with whom I have had and happily continue to have endless conversations. Some sections here have already been published by Inquirer and Rappler. But this paper is still a new framing and is now divided into 4 parts. The first will be on the struggle for historical symbols in the Philippines and how political the process of canonization can be. And the second will be on UNESCO's World Heritage Standards, which ultimately get to decide on whether or not our historical monuments pass international muster. I will be doing this in the context of both the Black Lives Matter movement on the one hand and Philippine culture itself on the other. Part 3 will look at how national narratives are framed in the Philippines and how that in turn affects how the government bureaucracy is organized, which can often become very problematic in terms of protecting heritage. The latter is, after all, not merely an architectural concern, but one that spans many disciplines, like anthropology, archaeology, education, and history. In part 4, I attempt to make some constructive policy recommendations using specific examples and drawing upon practitioners whose work I respect. I contend that there are ways of making Philippine monuments more democratic and ultimately more representative of our complex and very heterogeneous population. I would like to emphasize that I am less interested here in close formalist readings of specific monuments. I generally focus on historical figures rather than historical events, although I will touch upon them. I am sorry, I am particularly interested in the need to monumentalize both historical events and figures in the first place. Finally, as T.S. Eliot would say, I look at the idea of the phrase, consequently we rejoice, having to construct something upon which to rejoice. So finally, the consideration of specific monuments in the Philippines will have to be a separate paper. Okay, so I begin with realpolitik, okay, the struggle for historical symbols. So these are interesting times we live in. The push and pull of historical memory, of amnesia on the one hand, and its reclaiming on the other. But who does the writing of history actually serve? Witness the series of historical revisionisms going on in the Philippines today. Like Paolo Duterte, Deputy Speaker of the House and the son of President Duterte, wanting to change the name of the Ninoy Aquino International Airport in an effort to erase the latter's legacy. Not to mention the stealthy burial of Ferdinand Marcos in the Libingan ng mga Bayani, which is our hero cemetery, without public knowledge or consent. And the Department of Education's continued failure through all post-EDSA administrations to ensure that martial law's atrocities were remembered in our school textbooks. While the Aquinos were not perfect, and heroizing them or anyone else is deeply problematic, these are obvious efforts at historical erasure for short-sighted political ends. As I all too vividly recall, a so-called feminist at the Department of Foreign Affairs during my time went to great lengths to write urgent letters to the Manila City government and the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, who then prevailed upon the Department of Public Works and Highways, with the approval of the National Economic Development Authority, to take down the statue of a comfort woman on Rojas Boulevard. Hence the cover image for this talk. The priority, not to aggravate Japan at all costs, as if these women's harrowing experiences had never happened. While Noynoy Aquino did prosecute Gloria Macapagal Arroyo and hound Chief Justice Renato Corona, possibly unfairly, he at least did not attempt to rewrite history. In fact, my criticism of the Department of Education at the time, and during that of Cory Aquino, was, as I mentioned above, the invisibility of martial law atrocities in secondary school textbooks. Like many liberals the world over, the Aquinos took the notion of change for granted, as if it were necessarily linear, and as if dictatorship could not return. Many in the leadership, in my experience, were elitist and self-congratulatory throughout. But these are not the only narrative arcs here. There are now welcome moves all over the world to take an attempt to reframe what we call master narratives. Of course, there are obvious differences between erasing a figure like Ninoy Aquino on the one hand and tearing down Confederate and imperial monuments on the other. Simply put, the Duterte administration is using its power to cover up the legacy of the Marcos dictatorship. The Black Lives Matter advocates, in contrast, seek to take down Confederate statues as part of a larger movement for racial justice, and in the case of colonial monuments, decolonization itself. They are demanding that history now be reframed, that their voices now be heard. So it has to do with a marked difference in their respective positions within the social hierarchy. In other words, we are talking about power. No, the writing of history is generally dominated by the victors, who tend to be heroized. Most tend to be white, male members of social elites. For instance, while UNESCO has made it a point to remember the horrors of Auschwitz and Birkenau under Nazi rule, which is deeply important, its description of some of the pyramids of Egypt is all about their outstanding universal value, integrity, and authenticity. Regrettably, there is no discussion about the fact that they were built by slaves. I will be expanding upon this point extensively later. Do monuments also perpetuate romantic narratives? Dr. Stephen Acabado, for example, has drawn attention to the dating of some of the terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The notion that they were 2,000 years old, he observes, is a form of romanticizing an idyllic pre-colonial past. But his research has been largely ignored because there were fears among cultural agencies of a UNESCO delisting, which were, in my view, largely unfounded. Most of the government reactions I encountered during my time were merely political with little academic heft. But perhaps it is time to re-examine our ideas about heritage altogether, looking at its ideological moorings. To what extent is our view of heritage primarily Eurocentric and colonial? And now, of course, there are new global hegemons like China, towards whom the Philippines is currently genuflecting. This may explain much of the official prevarication I sadly encountered regarding the China-funded Binondo Intramuros Bridge's possible impact on the buffer zone of San Agustin Church, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, along with other Baroque churches. Most of my repeated efforts to bring the issue to the attention of higher-ups in different agencies were dismissed. It eventually became clear to me that, for many in government, preserving cultural heritage was not a major priority. My larger point, whether we preserve or tear down monuments, we need to reconsider the act of monumentalizing itself, recognizing that it remains deeply fraught and political. Okay, for part 2, I talk about UNESCO's World Heritage Standards in the context of Black Lives Matter and Philippine culture. So much for realpolitik. What theoretical lenses might help us understand the current crisis surrounding historical monuments the world over in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, among others before and after him, in the US, as well as the racial reckoning so eloquently demanded by all the global protests against it? The larger context of this latest historical push towards symbolic decolonization applies to all countries, including the Philippines. At its most basic level, the issues revolve around the relationship between monuments and historical commemoration. Who or what do these monuments celebrate, and what do they leave out? More pointedly, what do they erase, and what do they choose to celebrate and canonize? In looking at our heritage, perhaps we need to go beyond the conventional urge to merely add to collections and archive objects according to an accepted nationalist narrative. How do we in the Philippines address questions of memory and memorialization? To begin with, we might ask, what is a monument and what is it for? As Karl Marx once observed, contradiction is the motor of history. It turns the past into an open-ended site of struggle. Monuments are attempts to resolve the contradictions of history in favor of producing a unified account of the past. They rise in order to suture open wounds. All too often, however, they fail to close those very wounds. Perhaps in questioning our own assumptions, we might look at what Terry Eagleton once described as the ideology of the aesthetic. His point is that texts can be properly understood in the context of their historical circumstances or the conditions of their production. The value of this kind of cultural criticism is that it gives us the methodological tools with which to study both structures and relations of power. It allows us to think of monuments not simply as hallmarks of civilization, but also, as Walter Benjamin once wrote, as documents of barbarism. By monumentalizing heroes, do we also fetishize them, turning them into idols to be worshipped, rather than as important human beings with their own respective flaws and weaknesses? It is useful to look at all these questions in the context of UNESCO, which tries to foster global peace by igniting intellectual partnerships between and among nations. While many of its original principles and conventions are deeply laudable, it cannot be denied that the international agency tends to subscribe to what we call Enlightenment notions of what constitute heritage and beauty. Perhaps Elizabeth Betsy Kyo from the Washington University School of Law is too scathing and dismissive here, but her thoughts do merit consideration. At its best, the World Heritage Program is characterized as teetering on its once sound foundations as its principles and priorities crumble under the weight of bureaucracy and outside influence. At its worst, the program has left its original aims in the dust in favor of materialism and pacification, and is now incapable of protecting the world's truly endangered places. Similarly, Lynn Meskel wrote a book for Oxford University Press, A Future in Ruins, observes, often critiqued for its inherent Eurocentrism, UNESCO and its World Heritage Program today remain embedded within modernist principles of progress and development and subscribe to the liberal principles of diplomacy and mutual tolerance. However, its mission to prevent conflict, destruction, and intolerance, while noble and much needed, increasingly falls short. This is not the space to critique UNESCO, which continues to have great value, in my opinion, particularly during such conflicted times. My point simply is that in such a context, the Philippines often tends to be seen as merely derivative and marginal compared to other monumental cultures. What might be an alternative view, you might ask? Rather than think of the absence of monuments in the Philippines, perhaps we can think of the presence of another set of traditions to mark and commemorate the past. Here, anthropology can be very useful. William Henry Scott, in Pre-Hispanic Source Studies for the Study of Philippine History, points out that, given the absence of a centralized state structure, much less an empire in pre-colonial societies, there was neither the technology nor the social need for monuments. Rather than a monumental tradition, there existed an ornamental one, characterized by elaborate practices of weaving, jewelry making, tattooing, and decorative dentistry, etc., that focused on the body as the bearer of status. In my opinion, the importance of the ornamental and functional over the monumental tends to be overlooked because of the preoccupation with World Heritage sites among certain actors in the Philippine state. But I would argue that our strengths lie precisely in the areas of intangible cultural heritage and other forms of UNESCO inscription. The problems with intangible cultural heritage in the Philippines merit a deeper discussion elsewhere, but they are often tied to notions of romanticism for an idyllic, primordial, pristine past, as opposed to an organic contemporary one, which regrettably some key gatekeepers in government still cling to, despite all the theoretical work that has already been done by cultural critics the world over. This is why, during my time as Secretary General of the Philippine National Commission for UNESCO, my staff and I, along with other agencies, also focused on other of UNESCO mission World Heritage. I am happy to say that we were able to get 4 UNESCO designations in the country: in intangible cultural heritage, creative cities, and memory of the world. In my personal view, these national achievements are as important as World Heritage inscriptions, since they reflect the vibrant byways and lifeways of particular Filipino communities. Okay, now part 3. I talk about national narratives and the Philippine bureaucracy. In the Philippines, like many countries, the dominant historical narratives tend to be nationalist ones. But as Benedict Anderson has argued, we need to problematize the notion of nation itself. Who speaks for the nation and who in turn is spoken for? Whose interests does it serve and represent? What does it encompass? Frederick Douglass persuasively engaged with the notion of America's independence and what it meant for him as a Black slave. Did it include his voice, his story? The answer was a resounding no. As I have said, the Black Lives Matter movement contends that many monuments the world over represent white male master narratives. Similarly, in the Philippines, many of our monuments, like our nationalist narratives, address the concerns and history of colonial and social elites. For instance, the narrative depicted in San Agustin Church is a purely Augustinian one, and one that does not involve other social voices. So again, I ask, is our understanding of heritage in the Philippines primarily Eurocentric and colonial? In this moment of racial reckoning and decolonization, we are witnessing an urge to dethrone monuments, which some might describe as iconoclasm, on the one hand, and a desire to preserve them on the other. Which monuments should we keep, and which should we retire to museums? Indeed, how do we rethink the relationship between monuments and public spaces? Which publics are being served by such directions? These questions must be asked as we attempt to engage with the reality, the forlorn reality, of the Philippine state and its sprawling bureaucracy. As I have noted, many continue to be preoccupied with UNESCO World Heritage status as a way to bolster nationalist narratives over other forms of UNESCO recognition. In which case, if we are to focus on World Heritage, we need the communities to buy in to the process of canonizing such sites, as Dr. Stephen Acabado has asserted. They are, after all, the key stakeholders. But how is this to be realized without significant budgetary support? While my old office, the Philippine National Commission for UNESCO, had a budget to look for new World Heritage sites, there were few dedicated funds to help preserve existing sites. Conservation was generally viewed as being under the purview of specific site managers, many of whom simply lacked technical skills and financial capacities. The economic reality meant that we had to try to partner with governors and mayors, many of whom had little interest in long-term heritage matters. Given the nature of the local government code and the shifting terrain of political power that informs it, most politicized the entire process. They were willing to help finance the writing of a World Heritage dossier with their respective communities, provided that they received the UNESCO inscription during and never after their respective political terms. Many wanted immediate symbolic credit. The technical inputs of scholars and communities were often ignored by some key players in national government. Sadly, during my time, very few experts were consulted about heritage matters relating to UNESCO, and my agency was routinely bypassed altogether. But the fact remains that the writing of a UNESCO dossier takes years of consultative work with communities. This is very difficult to do in a 3-year time frame. The Philippines simply does not receive the kind of long-term state support for such endeavors the way many other UNESCO member states do. Overhauling this may require revisiting the heritage law itself and some of its problematic categories and assumptions, a subject that merits a lengthy and substantive discussion elsewhere, although I do touch upon it in my conclusion. In addition, many in government during my time did not always appreciate the importance of heritage preservation. It was difficult to explain its value in economic terms to a number of agencies. Regrettably, this was the nature of much of the discourse I sadly encountered. For example, the China-funded Binondo Intramuros Bridge, the construction of which threatened to impact the buffer zone around San Agustin Church, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Department of Public Works and Highways was able to prevail upon a number of cultural agencies to downplay such concerns. The Department of Foreign Affairs, under which my old office falls, had little interest in such matters of soft power, except in the context of showcasing performance. Repeated requests that the Department of Education incorporate Philippine World Heritage Sites in the syllabi of high school textbooks were never taken up. Regrettably, something as critical as curriculum development, unlike building schools and classrooms, as well as consolidating K-12, has unfortunately not been at the forefront of the agency's agenda for several administrations. Why? Because the nature of government implies that complex issues like poverty and heritage, for example, end up falling under the respective domains of specific agencies. Each has its own bureaucracy, most of which remain deeply colonial and hierarchical. As with the academe, many fall under departmental silos. Key players in the education field hesitate to engage in culture because it happens to fall outside their official purview. Equally, a number of cultural agencies continue to have limited engagement with education. The National Economic and Development Authority itself, at least to my knowledge and during my time, has yet to make archaeological and heritage impact assessments, unlike environmental impact assessments, a requirement for new building projects, despite repeated efforts by the National Commission on Culture and the Arts to engage them. Here I would argue that the state will have to address these issues in an interdisciplinary manner so that the agenda and concerns of each agency are given equal credence. Okay, what are my recommendations going forward? What solutions might there be to the endless problems I have just raised? To begin with, regarding buffer zones around monuments, Dr. Ian Morley, our moderator today, suggests that open areas, referring to natural and man-made landscapes from the perspective of people's physical and mental well-being, should be protected. This point was made in 2018 with reference to Baguio City and not any specific monuments. But he continues to maintain that it is not just the historical monument, but the space around it that should be preserved, resisting urban encroachment. As he observes, space for space's sake is not always respected in Philippine political culture. While this would certainly be ideal, respecting space by defining boundaries can naturally become a complex political process, requiring negotiations with both the public, national and local, and private sectors. The controversial Torre de Manila near the Rizal Monument is a case in point. Since the monument is not a UNESCO World Heritage Site, It is lugubriously described instead as a national monument and national cultural treasure situated in a national historical landmark. Notice how often the word national is used. It technically falls under the jurisdiction of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines and the National Museum. Therefore, the National Commission on Culture and the Arts may have arguably overstepped its bounds in issuing a cease and desist order to protect the Rizal Monument. So the question is, what kind of protections are provided for such sites? As Dr. Morley asks, what does the entire episode suggest about space, law, and urban development in the Philippines? What precedent did the Supreme Court ruling set for the preservation of areas around prominent urban spaces? How do we take this knowledge forward and, in so doing, better protect open areas? In my view, the limitations of the Philippine Heritage Law, RA 10066, in such cases bears careful scrutiny. In comparison, with respect to UNESCO World Heritage Sites, architect Joel Rico has also pointed to the limitations of this law, suggesting that the Philippines should draft a new law specifically for the latter, addressing not only the sites themselves, but also the buffer zones, a UNESCO concept that is not explicitly clear under Philippine law around them. What do they constitute? Where do they begin and end? And how do we ensure their conservation and protection? Ideally, in my involved the National Commission on Culture and the Arts, the Philippine National Commission for UNESCO, the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources, and the Department of Education, with the supervision of the National Economic and Development Authority, which would then guide the Department of Public Works and Highways and the Department of Interior Local Government accordingly. Penal provisions should be provided in the new law in the event that constructions do not follow specified guidelines. As I have said elsewhere, it is therefore critical that the National Economic and Development Authority make archaeological and heritage impact assessments a standard requirement before approving new constructions. Once this has been systematized, a massive educational campaign to local government units and schools will be important to raise cultural awareness. As for monuments themselves, I suggest that what we now need are deeper conversations about what they represent, along with our own notions of heritage. These conversations should include multiple stakeholders tackling deeper issues of historical and cultural representation. Perhaps, indeed, my argument is that we need additional markers on existing elite monuments that broaden and democratize their social and historical context. Please note that I am not advocating tearing anything down. The bitter reality about what has been happening in the Philippines for some time now is that elite families with money build monuments to their ancestors, like the Marcos and Romulo clans. But many historically important families do not always have the money to do this. can the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, the National Commission on Culture and the Arts, and ICOMOS itself, along with other agencies, help to keep historical recognition more balanced? Since the markers of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines tend to be around 200 words, there is not much textual room to maneuver around. So I am suggesting, after a lengthy narrative praising a historical figure's many achievements, for example, that a sentence or two be added to provide more objective social context. For example, regarding Ferdinand Marcos, one might say, Marcos, who undoubtedly achieved XYZ, is also perceived as having heavily plundered the Philippines during his tenure as president. Human rights groups assert that torture and killings of dissidents were rampant. In the same way, after all the heroism and praise of succeeding presidents, one might mention the decentralization of corruption, the rise of vigilante groups, and the failure of land reform under Cory Aquino, quitting, illegal gambling, and the bombing of Muslim insurgents in Mindanao under Joseph Estrada, corruption, Hello Garci, NBNZTN, for example, extrajudicial killings, and the Ampatuan massacre under Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and the disbursement acceleration program, Mama Sapano, Yolanda, and social elitism under Noynoy Aquino, for example. And my family is by no means exempt from such scrutiny. As for my uncle, Fidel V. Ramos, one might say, having achieved thus and thus, some human rights groups critique Ramos for having been one of the architects of martial law and for his role in counterinsurgency campaigns against the CUHKs and the communists. With regard to the voyage of Magellan that the National Historical Commission of the Philippines is hoping to commemorate with historical markers, one might mention how it also set about a train of disasters, from the violent displacement of native peoples, forced labor, and many other horrors associated with colonial rule. And while Lapu-Lapu is stereotypically seen as the first Filipino who resisted foreign rule, it might be more accurate to say that he was acting as a local chief at war with other local chiefs, since something like the Filipino nation was at least still 400 years from being imagined. Rizal, of course, is the most celebrated of our heroes, and much is known about his life. But why he decided to go to Cuba to help Spain in 1896 as the revolution in the Philippines was breaking out continues to remain a mystery. As for monumentalizing the galleon trade at UNESCO as a transnational nomination with Spain and Mexico, it should not only commemorate the actions of those who benefited the most from this trade, mainly Spanish and Mexican merchants. It should also make sure to point out the crucial importance of Chinese traders and tradesmen who brought the goods shipped on the galleon. The question is, therefore, is China not being involved in the dossier for reasons of political and bureaucratic expediency rather than scholarship and empirical fact? Even more important is to mark the vital role of native workers from the Philippines who, through the exploitation of forced labor, hauled the logs, built the ships, and sailed them across the Pacific Sorry, I just need a few more minutes. Without the Chinese and what the Spaniards would call Indios or Filipino natives, the galleon trade would simply not have existed. So another question is, how edifying, in fact, was the galleon trade in the Philippines? And why should we Filipinos participate in such a UNESCO transnational nomination? Okay, I'm going to have to rush ahead. Perhaps we might also consider the importance of creating monuments to other voices, depicting different communities, Chinese, Indians, indigenous peoples, classes, women and LGBTQs, and religious denominations like Islam and Protestantism. Monuments in malls, for example, depicting market vendors, fisher folk, jeepney drivers, persons with disability, domestic and service workers, OFWs, among others. In this regard, the memorial marker, I'm almost finished, the memorial marker for Kian Lloyd de los Santos at the San Roque Cathedral in Caloocan City, which serves not only to remember the murdered boy, but other victims of the current war on drugs, is a welcome addition. So, to conclude, in this day and age, is our nationalist narrative still primarily Catholic, cacique, or landowning, or animist? Indeed, is monumental architecture even the best way to highlight the multiplicity of our cultures? What other architectural approaches and cultural markers can we use to represent the past in the present and for the future? More importantly, perhaps it is time that Filipinos develop a more sober, critical eye, one that does not have to be dismissive or judgmental, not only about themselves and each other, but also about their political leaders. Unless we address this, beginning with our educational system and our school textbooks, we may continue to endlessly romanticize our historical past, the way Confederate statues in America and imperial monuments the world over have done. In the Philippines, this has often led to political naivete among our voting public, who should ideally be encouraged to understand their leaders with greater objectivity and maturity, instead of buying into personality cults. In my view, historical markers that provide positive accolades about our leaders on the one hand, but also inject empirically verifiable social context on the other are crucial and would go a long way in preventing us from unnecessarily heroizing important, albeit always flawed, national figures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lila, for your enriching presentation. Just a reminder to all attendees that you can ask questions on our presentation using the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll tackle select questions during the question and answer segment in the end. So for our next portion, we'll now be moving on to response from our invited reactor, Dr. Ian Morley. As an introduction, Ian Morley is an associate professor in the Department of History and associate professor in CUHK's Urban Studies program. He has published widely on the design of built environments and participated in TV documentaries. Just recently, he achieved the status of Senior Fellow from the UK Professional Standards Framework and was a recipient of the Bosma Prize in Planning History Innovation in 2020 from the International Planning History Society for his book, American Colonization and the City Beautiful, Filipinos in Planning in the Philippines. So you have the floor, Dr. Morley.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Good morning to those of you in Asia and Europe. good afternoon to those of you in Australasia, and good evening to persons in the Americas. I should say thank you to ICOMOS Philippines for inviting me today, giving me the opportunity to respond to Lila's talk. And in conjunction, I should thank Lila for her time and energy that had been invested into what was a very thought-provoking paper. So my job as a responder is to offer some comments. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to steer clear of the issues of UNESCO and the process of heritage in the form of organization. What I want to do is think of it more in terms of what we see, what it means. And again, Lila referenced the Black Lives Matters movement. And I think in the broadest sense, this has encouraged a deep global debate about the meaning of monuments and in particular statuary. The assumption that we have is that monuments represent all people in society, but the Black Lives Movement has shown that this is a fundamentally flawed perspective. Black Lives Movement has explicitly exposed that monuments can be seen and so read differently by different persons within our communities. Therefore, as much as we see in abstract monuments as unifiers, that in the sense that they encourage us to see and feel that we possess, what we belong to a common identity, what current events have essentially exposed is that quite clearly different people see monuments through very different lenses, and therefore they have very different meanings to them. In a sense, a monument can exacerbate and expose fragmentations that exist within society rather than unify. The bigger picture of Lila's paper, in a sense, tenders a massive question, which is, what do monuments mean? In a sense, how do they come to acquire meaning? How did they acquire meaning in the past? How do they still have meaning to us today? And how will they have continued meaning in the future? These are very, very big points. Now, to this end, or to this question, I wish to draw upon notions of philosophy, in a sense, to respond to what Lila is saying. Accordingly, again, my question is, how do monuments come to acquire meaning? And I'm going to reference Nelson Goodman and Catherine Elgin in their book, Reconceptions of Philosophy, because they essentially argue that the built environment, and of course this is what we're talking about today, the built fabric, built heritage, acquires symbolic capital through 4 different means: through what it denotes, through what it exemplifies, through what it expresses, and then the mediated references that are built into the design so that we literally and metaphorically get meaning from what we see. I think what is really important is, in terms of these scaffolds, for instance, denotation, what is its name, what is its narration, what does it describe? Exemplification, what certain characteristics does it have in its structure? These kind of matters, we need to conceptually unpick these scaffolds in order to, in a sense, reframe or maybe rewrite what heritage is as a material object. And again, to this end, I wish to dispel much of the social media comments that are put forward as that built heritage in particular only belongs to certain people in society, namely a certain vocation, architects. Again, I can understand why people from a certain perspective have that viewpoint as a doctorate, as a holder of a doctorate in architecture. But I think there's a fundamental, again, problem here, that unless heritage is appreciated by all people, by all communities in society, for its strengths and its flaws, then in essence, as a concept, heritage is nothing but elitist and open to certain groups, be it politicians or certain vocations, to solely determine what they say has value to society. Lila's talk underscores, in my view, that heritage has to become experienced for it to be heritage. In this context, what becomes apparent is the sense of the importance of memory and remembering, sometimes selective memory. But thanks to different cultural identities, we need to better appreciate how people will see and read how the different results are produced. We need to not neglect one basic point. Monuments are formed to be seen. And in order to see, the notion is that we will then possess and own it, so to speak. Yet it is almost inevitable that when monuments are employed to provide a physical representation of, for instance, the notion of common identity, that different people will not always view monuments through this unifying lens. If monuments are formed to convey the ideas of timeless values and unbroken lineage to those values which underpin common identity, then as the Black Lives Matter movement emphasizes, those links for certain groups within society are at best tenuous. And therefore, thinking intellectually, there's a wider need within the heritage community to recognize how links between heritage and identified are not only developed, but maintained as society evolves. The sort of identity work offered via monuments are typically assumed to be non-problematic. In other words, because we can see, we can all share the same values and readings of the architectural feature within the built environment. But if monuments are to be viewed as underpinning the greatness of a nation or an individual that is seen to be representative of that nation, then who is selecting and what, in a sense, are we commemorating? The French explain this through the word patrimony, a concept of inheritance, albeit one that in part promotes the idea of a particular duty to the past and its monuments. The duty of the present is to receive and revere what has been passed on from generations prior. But as I've said, recent events in numerous countries, umbrellaed under the label of the Black Lives Matter movement, test this sense of duty. At the same time, it therefore tests how we see. Irrespective of what monuments we have, if we believe it is our duty as citizens to revere those who lived before us, then how do we select new persons to revere? And where shall monuments to them be erected in the future? In a city like Manila, arguably there are few sites freely accessible to the public for such a purpose. At the same time, how do we tender value to persons who have helped form a country into being a highly civilized nation, in inverted commas? How will they be revered in the form of future monuments as witnesses to an era of cultural evolution that maybe overrides material development, yet establishes a sense of memory to which all persons, rich or poor, male or female, young or old, can tap into? Where does the authority come from to articulate such values and meanings, which allegedly are inherent in us all? Furthermore, what systems are in place within society to ensure monuments not only show off the sense of place, and in this regards, 2 points must quickly be raised. Firstly, how is society able to facilitate the understandings of a monument and to reveal it without ever distorting its meaning? And then secondly, for a sense of place to be inherent within the fabric of a built environment, the object has to be seen. It has to be inseparable from the site, the broader site into which it is set. So to sum up, the topic of historical memory and its application into the form of monuments is not only complicated, but it needs to be recognized as evolving as society changes. Master narratives, as Lila referred to them, will therefore never be read through time in the same way, simply because people in society culturally grow and see themselves and their country differently from how their predecessors did. Past ideological moorings will weaken, and new ones will be found to give meanings, new meanings, to the environmental features we see in our towns and cities. And as I've referenced with Black Lives Matter, those meanings can be negative as much as can be positive in some instances. Furthermore, if monuments are worthy objects of heritage, and if heritage is valuable to tourism promotion, by what narrative is heritage employed as a facet of governance? I see almost daily something by the City Hall in Manila as to issues of heritage, but in what narrative and through what forms of explanation is that narrative given meaning? To me, it's unclear. And finally, I wish to touch upon the issue of monuments within their environments, and again, the notion of governance with respect to sustainability. Urban environments and the features within them are not sustainable if they are not equitable. That is the fundamental value that the Black Lives Matter movement has shown, if nothing else. So in the present day situation of the COVID pandemic, how as part of future social resilience can public space and structural features within them be used to foster a collective commitment to the shared vision of what a flourishing community is? How can monuments be employed to recognize and actualize those previously who have been marginalized? How can the gap between we and them basically be breached? How can monuments be discussed and in the future erected in order to help expand social capital as part of society's post-COVID resilience? Thank you so much.
Thank you for your response, Dr. Morley. We'll now be moving on to the last part of our program, our 20-minute question and answer portion, to be moderated by Dr. Vicente Rafael. So Dr. Rafael is the Giovanni and Ann Costigan Professor of History and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. He is the author of several books and articles on the history and cultural politics of the Philippines, including Contracting Colonialism, Translation and Christian Conversion in Tagalog Society under Early Spanish Rule, The Promise of the Foreign, Nationalism, and the Techniques of Translation in the Spanish Philippines, among others. He is also the recipient of several awards, most notably the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, postdoctoral fellowships at Stanford University, East-West Center, and University of Hawaii, among others. We give you the floor, Dr. Rafael.
Hello. I have a very, very simple task, which is to field questions and to encourage discussion. So let me see, somebody's supposed to field me questions, but I see a couple already, and one of it has to do with this very interesting incident with Mayor Isko Moreno, who apparently drew a lot of criticism when he paid his respects to Legazpi's tomb in San Agustin Church, and some people had said that how is this different? Shouldn't the Legazpi monument also be torn down? And so the question is that is there a middle path between utter iconoclasm on the one hand and romanticizing the colonial past on the other? So that's one question. Should I ask some more, or should we wait to hear responses?
It's up to you, Vince. It's your call if you want to organize them thematically.
Well, that's an interesting. Because the questions are still coming. So why don't we respond to this question? It's from Raymond Sebastian. So why don't we respond to this question first, and then I can keep going and asking more as I read them.
Okay. Hi, Raymond.
Oh, actually, it's a two-part question. Yes, the other part, I'm sure you'll be very interested in. I didn't know this, that in Clark, Pampanga, there's a statue of a kamikaze pilot, which is a tourist attraction for Japanese, and yet Filipinos can't even build a statue. How is this just? So we can start with those two questions first, the Legazpi question and the comfort women question.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Both are very interesting questions. For the first question, I would say regarding Legazpi, that's precisely my point. My point is that because we are not, quote unquote, a monumental culture, having experienced how UNESCO works a little bit, do not advocate iconoclasm or tearing down our monuments, because we don't really have that many relative to other countries, whether in the developing or developed world. I don't recommend tearing anything down. What I am precisely saying is, to existing monuments, add more social history and start considering the possibility of new monuments, the possibility of funding new monuments. I think that LGUs, for example, can be approached with this wonderful idea. And I think many of them might actually support it. So for the second question, well, yes, it's atrocious. You're right. A kamikaze statue being unexamined in the context of Japanese colonial rule and the horrors it spawned is a terrible thing. And so again, my position, don't pull down, add context. Thanks.
This is a question from someone that many of us know, Dr. Jose Victor Torres from La Salle University, and he asks, is it the responsibility of historians to provide information to change the kinds of narratives and monuments? And how will this be possible? What will have to be made available for historians to be much more actively involved in changing narratives around monuments?
I think this is a very interesting topic I have struggled with. I mean, where do intellectuals fit into the state structure? You know, and I've been agonizing about this for many years, and so there's not an easy answer. But I think coming from a family that has been in government and having many friends in academia and the arts, I will say that the tragedy for me, being in the nexus, if you will, is that both sides tend to dismiss each other. You know, academics generally feel that everyone in the entire state structure, whether you're executive or legislative or judiciary, you know, you're just, you know, well, even if you are an agency that has no possibility to steal money because it's just a little think tank, they just assume everyone in government is hopeless and evil, right? And then there are the state, which tends to honor lawyers in the matter of human rights and economists in matters relating to poverty. As if, I mean, you know, like I'm talking about in cabinet meetings that I have attended, cultural agencies, historians, they're not really, you know, at the forefront of much of the discussion. Although, as Tina pointed out in the chat, it's wonderful that in the Philippine Development Plan, there is now Chapter 7 regarding culture. I feel that, that said, I do believe that in my time, my 13 years in government, I did encounter some intellectuals, most of whom were not cabinet level, but like undersecretaries, CESO people, were technocrats who know their stuff. I think it behooves historians to engage the state, just as I think it is necessary for the state to have some intellectual humility and always consult with scholars. During my time, that was not the case, but you know, I would argue that there is value in being makulit and just kind of, you know, I am, you know, I just kind of keep bugging people about what I think is ethically important. So yes, I think historians are the ones with the equipment, and therefore the role of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines is absolutely critical. And as I just want it on record that I have questions about the Magellan voyage that they are hoping to commemorate. Thanks.
I think Ian Morley, Ian, you wanted to add to this whole question of the role of historians in monumentalizing the past.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to add to what Lila's just said. I think, look, the historian has a very important role to play, simply because historians can help explain the process and context behind the creation of monuments. In other words, how and why monuments have come into being. Likewise, I was critical, but architects have a role to play in this process. Architects can deal with what the monument is in its structural sense. But I do have a problem when architects have this reductionist viewpoint of trying to merely describe what architecture or what features something has and therefore why it has value. That, to me, is disconnecting from the process of society. So historians do have a vital role to play. But of course, we have to think just for a moment about what are the historical traditions, intellectual traditions of the Philippines. Things are often explained culturally or politically. That's no problem. But where does the urban come into this? Most monuments are in a site. So my concern, if that's the right word, is that as important as the role is of historians to inform the public, particularly public historians, they need to do it in a way where they are presenting the whole picture, not just the political, the legal, the cultural, but the urban context in which monuments are created, but to do it in a way that is comprehensible to the public. And again, this is the challenge. How can you take something that is complex, sometimes convoluted, and try and make this very gray, muddy topic into something very black and white? But if the broader question from Professor Torres is, do historians have a role to play? Yes, they have a very, very important intellectual role. Thank you.
Here's a very straightforward question from Rancho Arcilia, who says, ang sadyang layunin ba ng monumento ay ang pagpapatama ng pusong Pilipino? Is the explicit purpose of monumentalization or of the monument simply the generation of pride among Filipinos? Is it all about pride, or is it about something else?
I'd like to address that, and I think that was actually Paulo Alcazaran's question, because I saw it in the chat, not Rancho's.
Oh, well, it was Rancho who sent it to me,
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and it's funny because I actually wanted to interrupt you, Vince, so that I could address that very important question. You know, there's a big debate in identity politics in academia. It's like, if you're a woman of color, are you always going to write about sexism and racism? You know, is that it? I mean, if you're going to make it into a mainstream publication, do you have to somehow market your suffering in terms of racism and sexism? Can't you write about mosquitoes and how they make you feel on a summer day? You know, so in other words, how political does a text always have to be? Or can you be a pure formalist, a pure aesthete? I think that Paula asks an excellent question, the gist of which is the sole purpose of making a monument one to hearten a sense of nationalism? Well, as you can see from my presentation and my talking about Benedict Anderson, I am critical about nationalism, nationalist narratives. What does it mean? And why is wearing a barong Tagalog not ethnic co-optation, but wearing an ethnic outfit co-optation? Like, you know, where do you draw the line? I think we limit ourselves in the art world because we are so obsessed with constructing nation. I think even in our films, there is a pedagogic, didactic quality rather than a playful, organic quality, because we're always trying to show that colonialism was bad and we were good and we fought them. And so I think you're right. I mean, we're not really all good and we all have faults. And there, to my mind, I mean, in the West, there are all kinds of monuments. There are monuments to artists. There are monuments to events. In fact, there was this wonderful article in the New York Times about a woman who said, my body is a Confederate monument because I was raped so many times. So I think nationalism can lead to xenophobia, and it can lead to many undesirable things. But I do understand why so much state budget and state preoccupation is spent on the need to construct a national narrative. But I think it tends to be a romantic narrative. So I think, to answer you, Paolo, I do think we should open up the possibility that hindi lang po kailangan yung pagpapataba ng puso. Thank you.
So there are a couple of some really, really interesting questions. Maybe I'll just read them out and then you can decide which ones you want to respond to. Follow up from Victoria says, question earlier, he has a follow-up about buffer zones and how does one determine the limits of a buffer zone, what is inside, what is outside, how do you enforce the rules of this separation? And this might have to go into this whole larger question of heritage law and what to do with heritage law. That's one question. The other question from someone from La Salle University, Jose Marie Calleja, asking to what extent universities can contribute to heritage preservation. Should there be, for example, a major in heritage preservation? Like you could actually get a degree in heritage preservation, and I know that's possible in universities abroad, but I don't know if that's possible in the Philippines so far. And finally, really important and I think very complicated question from Bradley Miles Fuentes Ramos, which is it goes to the heart of one of your themes, which is what's the relationship between monuments and truth-telling? He says, is it possible for a government organization such as the PNP and the AFP, for example, to construct monuments that will truthfully talk about their role in martial law, especially when that role is not a very flattering one, right? And the whole question of martial law, in fact, is very interesting because aside from pantayog ng mga bayani, there really isn't any attempt to sort of monumentalize either the victims or the perpetrators of martial law. So those are three questions, very broad, but might be interesting to tackle them as a way of finishing the session.
Vince, if you expect me to remember all that,
no. Okay. So
can I just
the first one.
I've heard you, but can you just give me a keyword for the first idea? Let me answer that, then give me a keyword for the second idea, because it's a lot.
Yeah. First is buffer zone. And the connection to heritage law. Second is courses in conservation at universities.
Mamaya na si second. First muna. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Regarding the buffer zone, it's such a complicated topic. I don't think there's enough time, and I'm also not the expert, but I do know, there are people like the head of Nayong Filipino, Kay Malilong, who's a heritage lawyer, and there are people like architect Joel Rico who have really talked about this extensively. But I do recall that UNESCO is extremely specific about the core zone, the buffer zone, the transition zone. And it's like both the core and the transition are sacrosanct. So not only is San Agustin a problem in relation to the Binondo Bridge's encroachment, although possibly it might not be a problem with the new modifications that they've been working on, but also Paway Church, where inside the core, they have built a garage and a souvenir shop and a comfort room. So, I mean, that's a problem. Now, the thing is, while the notion of buffer zone is sacrosanct for UNESCO, it's not very explicit in the heritage law. So I do really believe we should sit down and I mean, in the context of an administration that is concerned with build, 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 we really, really need to have those protections in place. Now, I believe the second question was about studying heritage. I think that's absolutely critical, but you know, one thing I will observe about the heritage culture in the Philippines is it's dominated by architects. And as if heritage was just I mean, built heritage, of course, has to do with buildings and monuments. But again, you know, we need to be able to include in these courses anthropologists, historians, archaeologists, and we need to mainstream these ideas in depth ed in our school textbooks. And I don't remember the third question.
Yeah, I think we're kind of out of time, so that's going to have to be it. Yeah,
So thank you very, very much. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone. Thank you so much, Tina, ICOMOS, Ian, Vince. It was a wonderful conversation, and it was lovely to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lila, Vince, and Ian for this wonderful talk. We're getting really good reviews about minds being open, questions they had not considered, and I think overall we did get ideas percolating. So thank you all. Actually, there's so much more to say, and we are keeping track of all your questions. And if you had registered, we can send answers to those questions to everybody by email. We're also doing a call to other ICOMOS members who would like to submit a paper on this, on Lila's talk, and we can consolidate it and come out with different positions or the same position. So a more in-depth discussion about this within the membership. So to everyone, thank you again for starting your week with us, your morning with us, and we'll see you at the next talk. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
We'd like to also give a special thank you to Intramuros administration for the technical support for this event. Of course, thank you to our speaker, Lila, our reactor, Dr. Ian, moderator, Dr. Vince, and of course, our organizing team for making this event possible. Short feedback forms will also be sent to all registrants so we can further improve our events for everybody. And details on certificates of attendance. You may send your requests to the official email of ICOMOS, info@icomosphilippines.com, or message us on Facebook. And I've seen some of the responses. We'll get back to you shortly. Thank you and have a good Monday, everyone.
Thank you.